A close American ally under attack as Russia flexes its muscles. World Report is in Georgia and the disputed territories for a rare look inside at the core of the conflict.
I understand that the international community see Georgia as example of democracy, but for Abkhazia, Georgia is still enemy.
As the United States seems unable to stop the onslaught, some ask, what is all this really about?
It's almost not about Georgia. It's about main values that the U.S. has always preached to all of us, and it's about American prestige, at least in this part of the world.
Beyond the headlines, behind the battle lines, an exclusive look at the conflict that could lead to a new Cold War, or worse. Now from inside the disputed territory of Abkhazia, here's correspondent Kira Kay.
Nestled in the picturesque mountains of Georgia, there is something called the Broken Bridge. Not broken, perhaps, in terms of splintered wood, but broken metaphorically. This is the fragile ceasefire line separating the rest of Georgia from its breakaway region, Abkhazia. Here, Georgian soldiers stand guard, warily watching their Russian counterparts on the other side of the ceasefire line. This is the front line to a new Cold War. Fierce fighting began just days after we took these pictures. These same Georgian troops found themselves fighting against overwhelming Russian firepower as the Russians and local militia advanced on Georgia from many directions, including across the Broken Bridge, turning this Cold War into a very hot one. It's a war that ultimately pits Russia against the United States. Cameraman Jason Maloney and I had arrived here in Georgia before Russia invaded. We had been granted rare access to Abkhazia, and we came here to discover what is at the root of this fighting, to find out why this small, obscure separatist territory is now at the center of a major conflict. The only way into Abkhazia is by United Nations airlift. We were entering a country that does not officially exist. Permission first had to come from the Abkhaz, who were in de facto control. They even issued us visas. That's a sign of the big issue here. Abkhazia, like another breakaway territory, South Ossetia, wants to be independent from Georgia, but Georgia refuses to let it go. Russia supports Abkhazia. The United States supports Georgia. In our very first few hours in Abkhazia, we were granted an interview with the so-called president of the breakaway province, Sergei Bagapsh.
I want to be honest in telling you that Abkhazia will never again in its history become part of Georgia, because it never was part of Georgia. We are ready to live next to one another, to build normal relations as two independent governments, but we will never be part of Georgia again.
Then President Bagapsh delivered a warning.
I am a realistic person, a realistic politician, and must tell the truth. The more danger there is of a new war between Abkhazia and Georgia, between Southern Ossetia and Georgia, the more likely war will not be limited to just Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia. If it explodes in one place, it will explode across all the Caucasus.
Are you preparing for war?
Yes, of course we are preparing. We see that Georgia is getting armed. We see that thousands of American military advisors are working in Georgia. Under the power of Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili, we have seen constant provocations in the region. He continues with this war rhetoric, trying to show how strong Georgia is. And so, of course, we are also arming ourselves. We have many friends, too, believe me.
Abkhazia and South Ossetia fought for their independence from Georgia when the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 1990s. Both wars ended in a stalemate, with Abkhazia no longer fully part of Georgia, but not independent either. After the war, most of the world sided with the Georgians and refused to recognize Abkhazia. U.S. policy says that Abkhazia should be part of Georgia, which it praises as a functioning, pro-Western democracy. Abkhazia, already battered by war, is isolated from the outside world and punished by international sanctions. So as a matter of absolute necessity, Abkhazia had to turn to its neighbor to the north, Russia, to survive, according to President Bagapsh.
Россия помогала нам гуманитарно.
Russia helped us with humanitarian aid. When our children were dying, every bit of help we were getting was coming from the Russian Federation. That is why we have had good friendly relations and will continue to have them. Today, Russia is our partner, and we are working on a lot of projects together. These days in Abkhazia, Russia accounts for 99% of our business. That is why it is natural that we are discussing certain economic and political issues. No one listens to the Abkhazia side. We are not allowed to speak in the United Nations. They listen only to Georgia. So it is only natural that sometimes we ask Russia to make our voice heard.
Right after our interview, Bagapsh rushed off to the airport to fly to Moscow for meetings. Connections with Russia are not limited to the government. 80% of Abkhazia's estimated 200,000 residents now hold Russian citizenship and Russian passports. It's the only way they can travel to the outside world. And many elderly here receive monthly pensions from Moscow. Russia is Abkhazia's only official trading partner.
Nobody's interested in democratizing Abkhazia. There are a lot of players who are interested in restoring Georgia's territorial integrity, but very few ones are interested in developing Abkhazia internally.
Liana Kvarchelia runs a nonprofit focused on reconciliation and dialogue with Georgian counterparts. She met us outside the hulking remains of the former Soviet administration building, destroyed during the First War and left in ruins as a reminder.
Would you actually prefer for Abkhazia to have less of a relationship with Russia if it could have more relationships with the rest of the world?
I think what we want is to have balanced relationships with all our neighbors. Russia is a very big neighbor, and Russia can't be ignored. And in future, I think, of course, we will be developing our relations with Russia. But we want to be open to the rest of the world as well.
But for now, Abkhazia remains closed to most of the world. This is the Abkhaz capital, Sukhumi. Once beautiful, it was the chosen getaway of the Soviet elite. Joseph Stalin even built a vacation home here. There are still hints of the thriving resort town it once was, but it is now mostly faded and extensively war-ravaged. The clock tower may still work, but it feels as if time here stopped a long time ago. But though it may feel lost in time, Russian tourists still come here to enjoy Sukhumi's Black Sea beaches. They don't seem to mind lounging on a beach next to the rusty relics of cargo ships, or strolling the streets past bullet-scarred buildings. Russian tourism has helped shore up a struggling, isolated economy. Vegetables, bread, cheese, and other life staples like vodka are easily bought in the market. But you must pay in rubles, as the Russian currency is the only one accepted here.
What you see now, it is not much, but still it was done by our own hands. We did it. We raised this country from ruins after war. And we were isolated at the time when everybody was supported, but we were making all this by our own efforts. I think that we can show a very significant example of the country which can survive on its own.
Maxim Gungia has spent a decade in the Abkhaz Foreign Ministry. Gungia says his country also has built a democracy, one in fact as healthy as Georgia's.
What I like about Abkhazia is that it is like a small boat. If you want to maneuver, you can do a lot of good projects here. You can do reform, you can build this country the way you want. And I very much like the ideas of democracy, which are very deep in our culture. So you don't need a lot of change and revolution or whatever to make this country more democratic. It just needs more openness for the world.
But despite the optimistic language, even Gungia remains fully on guard.
We don't want to risk anymore. And if there is a choice between living for generations in an unrecognized country or to be part of Georgia, we all would rather choose to be unrecognized for many other years instead of putting life of our families and children into risk. I understand that international community see Georgia as example of democracy, but for Abkhazia, Georgia is still enemy. we still remember the past. We still remember that hatred. We don't want to risk anymore. We don't want any experiments.
The violence during the war between Abkhazian separatists and Georgia in the early 1990s was bloody and brutal. Even though the Balkans and Rwanda are considered the hallmarks of mass atrocity of the 1990s, the war in Abkhazia came first, with ethnic cleansing, neighbor turning on neighbor, and unspeakable brutality. There is a war memorial in town, but you don't need to visit it to remember what happened here. On every block, on every corner, empty shells stand where beautiful villas once hosted generals and leaders. Billboards all over town remind citizens of the heavy price they paid. The war may have been more than 15 years ago, but those wounds are still raw.
It was an ordinary day like this, when Georgian army just entered the city and started shooting. Just behind us, it was an Abkhaz archive on this lawn, and it was completely burnt. All documents about Abkhaz history were just destroyed.
What are your memories of those days?
Very bad memories. It's a very strange situation when you start to understand human reality, human identity. And humans are could be very cruel, very rough. It's very strange to see how people change in a second.
And there was a lot of violence against ethnic Georgians too.
You're right. This is war. It was a lot of crimes, I would say. When the fighting starts, you already can hardly say who is right, who is wrong. It is very, very sad situation.
Is there an ability here in society to forgive, and do you think it goes on both sides?
Probably it goes on both sides, but I think that the reconciliation takes a long time. But unless there is a political resolution of those contradictions that created this conflict, I don't see any prospect for reconciliation.
Sometimes when the situation with Georgia and relations with Georgia going very tense, I start feeling the smell of the war, which is very bad feeling.
You're afraid that this could happen again?
Yes, I'm very much afraid.
Whether the future will bring war or peace will largely be determined by a new generation of Abkhazians. 15 years have passed, and many young adults here don't even remember the terrible fighting of the 1990s. But as we were told when we sat down with members of a youth group at a popular seafront cafe, part of building their future is drawing on their past.
And I think that it is a duty, my duty, and not only mine, but the duty of everybody in Abkhazia to remember the war and to remember those people who gave their lives for us to live in a country, in our country, and not in the country of somebody else.
It's a time of discovery, where we young people have the opportunity to leave our trace on the history of our country. We have the opportunity to build a country, to develop it economically, in terms of education or in any other field. It's a good time.
I think that the main problem of the outside world is that they do think that Abkhazia is a separatist country, that there is war going on in the streets, that there's shootings and everywhere. But you might have noticed yourself that people are just walking here and living ordinary lives. What do? I'm a student at the university. I study, I work part-time, I'm enjoying my work, I have plans for the future.
A future no one here, however, takes for granted.
If necessary, are you ready to fight for your country?
Actually, I think that it isn't even necessary to ask this question, because of course I'm ready, like every other person who continues to consider himself to be Abkhazian. We will go and defend our motherland, our homeland, and fight for it.
Since we spoke to these young people, these men have joined a local militia as reservists, ready to fight the Georgians alongside Russian troops. Before the current war broke out, the United Nations kept the peace along ceasefire lines. Here in the town of Gali, a handful of ethnic Georgians have returned, warily. Hundreds of thousands had fled their homes in the 90s because of what many call ethnic cleansing by the Abkhaz.
What is the security situation in the village?
This man says he returned to Gali after the war to find his original house burned. So he rebuilt another one right next to it and tells us he will stay for now.
I am afraid a little bit, all the time.
Of what? What might happen?
Что может случиться? Почему вы боитесь?
There are lots of strangers here with automatic guns walking on the street. Nobody knows what they can do.
By strangers with guns, he says he means the Russians, who, as part of the 1994 ceasefire agreement that ended the war, also patrolled here before the latest fighting. They are referred to as peacekeepers, even though they clearly side with the Abkhaz against the Georgians. Russian troops, Georgian residents, Abkhaz militia, this all makes for a very complicated and volatile landscape. And now reports suggest the Abkhaz have taken control of the whole ceasefire region, restricting the UN's ability to protect the ethnic Georgians here. Back on the other side of the ceasefire line, the Georgian side, we were greeted by a larger-than-life portrait of Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili over a map that clearly shows Abkhazia and South Ossetia as parts of Georgia. After our trip to Abkhazia, we were summoned back to the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, for a midnight interview with Saakashvili, just hours before war was to break out between his country and Russia. He spoke frankly but warmly of his country's relationship with the United States.
We've run into many problems in this region because of our closeness and our political alliances with the United States. But I think it's a very solid relationship founded on values. So something that would outlive this president, the existing U.S. president, and this generation. I think there was one smart local observer who said that we are not pro-American, we are building America here.
Indeed, this is one of the few corners of the world where you can find a George W. Bush Street. While we were here, American Marines were helping train the Georgian army.
Hey, make sure they're not pointing their weapons at the mosque.
Georgia has been a steadfast supporter of American efforts in Iraq. It was the third largest member of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, until their troops had to come home to fight the Russians 2 weeks ago. Georgia also wants to join NATO, which the U.S. supports. This also greatly angers Russia.
This will be built in 6 months' time. Predicate.
President Saakashvili was not speaking like a man on the brink of war. He was eager to show us development projects he's working on for Georgia. But then our conversation turned serious, to the disputed territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Saakashvili insists they will always be part of Georgia, and Georgian refugees should be allowed to go home.
Now, if you throw out almost 500,000 people out of their houses based on their ethnic origin, you expel the population, and then this is one thing, of course, people can leave because of trouble and war, but then when they don't let them back based on their ethnic origin, when you distinguish based on ethnicity, I think this is ludicrous, this is barbaric. We are living in 21st century. I can never accept this.
Then I asked him about something I'd heard from both the Abkhaz and foreign observers.
A couple of analysts have suggested to me that at least once in the last 6 months, maybe twice, Georgia has considered military action against Abkhazia.
Well, you can speculate as much about it as you can. It's like Poland attacking Germany in 1939, or because this is not Abkhazia, this is Russia there. It's Russian, these are Russian troops. Anything that will be planned in Abkhazia will have to confront Russian troops there. They are present. And so if you are considering something like in that part of Georgia, you have to consider that it has everything to do with Russia. There is no real local army or local militia. You are dealing with Russian troops. With all the courage I can observe in our troops, nobody would be crazy enough to attack the Russian army, right?
But attack they did. Georgia launched an assault on South Ossetia. Fighting quickly broke out in parts of Abkhazia, too. And despite a current ceasefire, one thing is clear: this conflict is far from over.